Welcome to Back to the Texts Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 8 to 11 of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. Up to this point, we have established what it means to become a beginning philosopher, which is someone who throws off all judgments, beliefs, or claims that are not necessarily certain. We then consider the idea of science as a pursuit of evidence through the fulfillment of judgments by a given state of affairs. Different kinds of evidence were identified. The kind of evidence required for a universal grounded science is apodictic, wherein it is impossible to imagine a situation in which such evidence could even be doubted. Though the existence of the material world might seem to provide such evidence, it was determined that such evidence is, in fact, contingent upon sensation, which itself is subject to doubt. Yet, this encounter with certainty and doubt offers a clue for where to turn next, for there's something that certainty and doubt themselves are predicated upon, which is the experience of certainty and doubt by an experiencing subject, or what is called the ego. And so in this video, we'll address the following topics. 1. The phenomenon of the world versus the being of the world. 2. The phenomenological method of epoché and reduction. 3. The difference between adequate evidence and apodictic evidence. Though subtle, the distinction between assuming the being of something versus experiencing a phenomenon of being is a critical one here. Regardless of whether I eventually decide that the world exists or determine it to be an illusion, the phenomenon remains and forms the basis for such subsequent decisions. The phenomenon of the world is continuously there for me, always available in the stream of experience, most often and most originally as a conscious perception, but also in conscious memory, which recalls my past perceptions of that world. This distinction between the phenomenon of the world and the being of the world can be a little confusing. And so I'm going to provide another example, one drawn from my book, that I think helps to illustrate this point and really starts to get us into the implications of this phenomenological attitude that we're trying to present here. When one doubts, only a cause is doubted, not the facticity of the appearance itself. I may have mistakenly believed I was being chased, only to discover it was a dream. What I doubt is not the happening itself, that indeed I was affected in some manner. Instead, I doubt the dream's ontological status, meanings, and causes. Upon awakening, I ask myself whether it really happened. That is, whether the experience occurred in waking or dreaming. I ponder the meaning and source of the dream. Perhaps it represents an unconscious conflict, a working out of the day's worries, or simply random neural firings. And yet, each time I doubt, I direct it at everything except the appearing of the dream itself. And no amount of post hoc explanation can dissolve this unbidden arising. One may doubt interpretations, knowledge, and understanding about the appearance, but not that the appearance happened. Thus, what has served as the greatest source of skepticism, the appearance, is indeed the indubitable possibility of thought, and what has often been conferred the greatest certainty, the explanatory power of theoretical reason, is the most dubious of all. To put this example back in Husserl's language, the experience of the dream has an apodictic evidence that all other abstractions, theorizing causal explanations, and ontological determinations lack. And this helps to get us thinking about the difference between the appearance and its indubitability and the existence of something, the ontological status of it. And to be clear, though I haven't quite explained why yet, this is not an appearance as opposed to reality dualism, a phenomenon as opposed to the noumenon. But the appearance is the thing itself as it gives itself in appearance. And we'll see later on why that is the case. Despite Husserl's thought seeming to be highly abstract itself, It is, in fact, aimed at returning to the most tangible thing of all, the pure experience of the ego in its self-experiencing of the world as it appears, or perhaps more accurately, since we're not speaking literally about visual sensation here, as it gives itself to me. The ego is the constant feature of all these manners of experiencing the world. The same ego that withholds belief in that world and who comes to believe in it. Despite this shift in attitude, everything this ego experiences remains untouched. In withholding my claims toward the ontological status of the world doesn't suddenly disappear. Instead, the philosophizing ego merely practices abstention concerning all the meanings and judgments that could be leveled against that world. Everything these meanings and judgments are directed toward, the meant and the judged, are fully retained as they are, except for having undergone what Husserl calls an acceptance modification, being a mere phenomenon rather than taking for granted their ontological status. Now, this can all be fairly strange to one's ears because we can ask, didn't I just say that Husserl is trying to get at the most tangible thing of all? And yet here Husserl is communicating in a way that seems very far removed from our initial experience of things. However, this is due to our first conscious awareness of our experience inevitably being filtered through theoretical formulations. In our naive first-person experience, there is no initial immediacy of pure experience, only mediation. It's why something like Wilhelm Wundt's introspectionism, which marks the beginning of psychology as a science, or, to take a more contemporary example, many of the experiential exercises and writing assignments that are highly prevalent in colleges today are not phenomenological in this sense. And this is because such naive reflection remains far too imbued by abstraction. In other words, we relate to our world primarily through abstract concepts rather than the things themselves. And so something like common sense experience is fundamentally abstracted from reality rather than being closer to it. A kind of habitual way of abstracting, you might say. This is the potential pitfall of those who wish to do phenomenology without the rigors of some method. That method which Husserl developed and which was designated to enact this acceptance modification and lead us to the grounding certainty of an experiencing ego, he called the epoché and the reduction. The two concepts are often thought of as synonymous, yet in fact they represent distinct but inseparable steps in arriving at the ego. The phenomenological epoché, or parenthesizing, Husserl describes as the universal depriving of acceptance, this inhibiting or putting out of play of all positions taken toward the already given objective world, and, in the first place, all existential positions, those concerning being, illusion, possible being, being likely, probable, etc. Husserl's approach demands the epoché, which can begin to peel back these layers of abstraction by bracketing or parenthesizing all that cannot be led back to the experiencing ego. But the leading back is not exactly the same as the parenthesizing. The phenomenological method seeks not only to bracket or put on hold judgments about the world, but also requires a being led toward what is firm and indubitable. This is what is meant by the reduction. The epoché and reduction are two distinct but inseparable steps toward achieving what Husserl calls transcendental subjectivity, which itself entails one's pure conscious life that delivers everything experienced and accepted by me in the manner I experience it, whether by perceiving, remembering, valuing, desiring, etc. The term transcendental is applied here because this domain of subjectivity is thought to logically precede and have no dependence upon everything that it experiences. And for this reason, the fundamental phenomenological method is described as the transcendental epoché and the transcendental phenomenological reduction. But having achieved transcendental subjectivity through the epoché and reduction, does this then lead us to what we're ultimately after here, which is apodictic evidence? Husserl says it might seem not, for in asserting the apodicticity of the ego, one has to ask themselves whether this would include the ego's past, a past that seemingly is inseparable from it. Yet the kind of evidence available to memory itself is seemingly not apodictic. And here we have to make a distinction alluded to in the previous video but never quite made explicit. The distinction between apodictic evidence and adequate evidence. When something appears in full adequacy, it means that the thing being judged fully appears to me in its embodied actuality. Various examples could be conjured up by plotting the two kinds of evidence along orthogonal axes like this. So for example, I make a judgment my daughter is in her room. I go there and lo and behold, there she is, a perfectly fulfilling intuition or adequate evidence for my judgment. From within the frame of my situation, it makes little sense to doubt the adequacy of this evidence. It fulfills every aspect of my supposition concerning her whereabouts. Yet this evidence is not apodictic, for if I was to rigorously apply the epoché, I can imagine a situation in which I was mistaken. Perhaps it was someone only appearing as my daughter, but was in fact an impostor, however absurd that might sound. The point here is not that I'm doubting it's my daughter, only that such a possibility of having been mistaken is logically conceivable and does not meet the criterion, therefore, of an absolute grounded science that can take primacy over all other sciences. But now let's take another kind of example, the Pythagorean theorem. One thing I know from this theorem is that the third side of a perfect right triangle is always and necessarily obtainable when I have the measurements of the other two sides, even though in fact I have never had a direct experience of such a triangle except as a theoretical ideal. And indeed, ideal objects have their own kind of evidence, and one of Husserl's major contributions has been to broaden the concept of the object beyond the constraints of what has temporal and spatial coordinates, that is, material reality. And this is in part what got Husserl into philosophy, I believe, which was his interest in establishing the legitimacy of mathematics as a field as real and grounded as the material sciences. And so in one sense, this ideal perfect right-angled triangle gives nothing. There is no perfectly adequate evidence, no fulfilling intuition. Yet the theorem provides what is closer to apodictic evidence because it is nearly impossible to imagine a scenario in which it could be doubted. Though Descartes does provide the idea of the evil genius here to doubt our ability to do math and geometry. But the point here is just to show that there are different kinds of evidence. And I should add here that the evidence of the theorem itself is not primary since its apodictic evidence depends on establishing preceding evidence that itself is also apodictic. And that is the ego, the one who must be present to behold the theorem and its evidence in its formal abstract quality. So in a certain sense, there is no Pythagorean theorem without a conscious ego beholding it. And this will get us into the notion of solipsism, which Husserl will talk about a little bit later. What is most important here is that we have established the difference between adequate and apodictic evidence, and that the apodictic ego doesn't need to be given inadequate evidence to preserve its apodicticity. Though I have no certainty of whether my memory of a past moment is accurate, there's no adequate evidence, that is. Nonetheless, I have a kind of apodictic evidence that I am directly accessing my living present as it is directed to the activity of remembering. And just like as previously mentioned, I had some experience we call a dream that itself is not to be doubted, even if we could doubt its accuracy in terms of meanings, causes, and explanations. With the phenomenological method of epoché and reduction, I suspend judgment upon the world, and I'm led back to the apodictic evidence of my own experiencing ego, which is always a consciousness of something. The transcendental ego is not the same as my natural human ego. It's not reducible to psychic life, which is, in fields such as psychology, treated as a piece of the world rather than radically preceding the world altogether. And I think it's important here to emphasize that we are speaking about preceding in the sense of logical time rather than our ordinary understanding of time in regards to causality, cause and effect time. The world precedes me historically, of course, even as, logically speaking, my consciousness logically precedes or is a precondition for there being anything like a historical world in the first place. And this will be a source of tension within the phenomenological tradition, which we'll have to return to at some point. But it's also an issue that Husserl himself is not unaware of, and he will address this matter later on in this work. It will become especially important as we consider an important distinction he makes between what he calls static phenomenology and a genetic phenomenology. A final point to emphasize here is that in performing the epoché and reduction, nothing changes. I do not lose my world, I do not lose my empirical psyche. They remain there just as they always were found there. There is only the modification I have undergone concerning my attitude toward them, which, rather than closing me off from what they have to offer, will in fact expand what I can see of them. And this harkens back to the epoché's roots in ancient Greek philosophy, expressed by the concept of ataraxia, whereby one frees oneself from the agitations of mental attachments that narrow our range of vision. And so through ataraxia, we achieve sort of an equanimity toward all of reality, letting it speak to us in the diverse manifolds of its appearing. If you found this video helpful, and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching. And until next time, be well.